Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Tessa Lewin. I'm one of the co-conveners of this panel with my colleague Deepa Chopra, who will be presenting later today. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and I also co-convene the policy and practice strand of our Countering Backlash program at IDS. And this is the first of two panels, P28, and both of them will explore women's struggles that visibilize inequalities and intersectional oppressions with a focus on strategies to counter or unsettle backlash. There's a lot of literature documenting the backlash, the majority in the States and in Eastern Europe, although that's beginning to change, but there's much less documentation on struggles against it. So we wanted to get a sense of what women's lived experiences of resistance are in different contexts. And what we've tried to do is spread the geography of the presentations so that we've got a sort of even mix across both panels. Today, we have Argentina, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan case studies. And on Friday, Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, and the United Kingdom. And I am going to hand over to my colleague, Helen Nazneen, who is going to be chairing this panel. Zahela also is involved in two programs looking at backlash at the Institute of Development Studies. She is a well-known gender expert working on gender development issues. And Zahela, I'm just going to hand straight over to you. I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you, Tessa and Deepa, for asking me to chair this very interesting panel today and also on Friday. We have very exciting presentations, particularly that focus on a range of issues that has recently faced pushback. So starting from looking at how what happens at policy level in terms of with Argentina, we will also look at in terms of women's protests against specific policies or against the state's oppressive measures and what kind of strategies women use to counter this. So welcome everyone to the panel. Our first presenter is Melissa Slepp, who will be presenting on A Tale of Feminist Struggle, the development and evolution of the campaign for access to legal, safe, and free abortion in Argentina. Those of you familiar with Argentina, you know that this has been a major victory for feminist activists, but it came after a long, long struggle, and you still have to be cautious, even if you have a victory. So Melissa will take us through this. Melissa, you have 15 minutes. I will give you a warning around when 2 minutes are left. So Melissa, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you to the panel conveners and DSA. I'm going to share my screen now. So if you can confirm that you're seeing what I'm seeing. The title, yes? Okay, so yes, I want to focus the presentation on this activist multi-stakeholder front that pushed for the legalization of abortion on demand in Argentina, which occurred, as you may know, in late 2020. And so the title is A Tale of Feminist Struggle. This is by no means a coincidence. Throughout this presentation, I'll be discussing discourse and policy change implications that, drawing from this analysis, were heavily influenced by the efforts made by the campaign for access to legal, safe, and free abortion. The campaign comprises over 700 organizations stemming from all parts of society, from feminist activists to workers' associations, journalists, lawyers, medical practitioners, you name it, they're there. And their efforts have been successful, thanks in no small part to the way that the campaign presented its story, its case, its arguments, and its logic. As such, three intertwining questions guide this piece of research. The first one is, what factors account for differentiated impacts in a gender setting for the legislative treatment, or lack thereof, of several iterations of an abortion bill? The second one is, what impact did the campaign have in providing a discourse change that was paramount in treating abortion access as an issue of public health? The third one is, what can we learn from the campaign from a feminist and activist perspective regarding the future of abortion access and feminist struggles in Argentina, the Latin American region, and the global South as a whole? For the purpose of exploring these questions, I'm drawing from feminist Latin American scholars for the most part, stemming from the fields of law, political science, sociology, and social movement theory, among others. These are secondary sources I've used alongside a documentary review of material produced by organizations and individuals that are part of the campaign, as well as various seminars that the pandemic allowed me to participate in for an ex-post examination of the successes and challenges in the fight for abortion rights through the eyes of the protagonists themselves. So that was quite interesting. Before diving into the questions, I think that some context clues can help frame the analysis for those of you who may be not that familiar with Argentina. And for this, I'm referencing a timeline that I built recently that you're welcome to look and zoom into if you'd like. So the return of democracy in Argentina in the early 80s came with an accompanying reawakening of civic spaces. For feminist activism, this was encompassed in women meetings, which have been happening annually since 1986, uninterruptedly, in different locations around the very large federalized country that Argentina is. These meetings have been the platform for discussing issues pertaining to women and feminized identities. It was in one of such meetings that activists voted in favor of aligning efforts from different organizations into a single-minded goal, legalization of abortion. Thus, the campaign was born in 2005. It wasn't an easy process, as you can see. 15 years passed between the creation of the campaign itself and the actual passing of an abortion bill in Congress. 8 failed attempts, infinite strategies for engaging diverse audiences, and in the middle, Argentina did advance legislation on topics such as divorce, sexual and reproductive health, sexual education, and gender-based violence. Yet abortion was kept on the shelf. So this brings us to the first question that I posed earlier. What factors account for differentiated impacts in agenda setting? This question is trying to look into the cumulative process involved in getting a bill into Congress. According to activists, the fight towards legalization of abortion was accompanied by a process of social decriminalization of abortion, and the combination of both seems to be the key. Academia has analyzed this through a few lenses that I'd like to present briefly. The first explanation gears towards the relevance of internal factors, specifically the way the movement read the social context at the time. Barbara Sutton and Elizabeth Boland write that even if feminists in Argentina recognize women's rights, including abortion rights, to be part of universal human rights, they operate in a setting where they must engage with others who think about human rights violations in a narrower way, or mostly in relation to specific events in Argentina's recent history. They refer to the last military dictatorship. Monica Tarducci agrees. The campaign intertwined abortion rights as a debt of democracy, pairing it with the political awakening of new generations of feminist activists for whom which the campaign resonated strongly. And this was the context of discussion of the bill in 2018 and later in 2020. Somewhat similarly, in terms of strategic thinking, Mariela Davi and Mason Mosley argue in favor of the expansion of social justice frame in feminist movements, but we'll tie this over into the next question, suffice to just mention it here briefly. And then Cora Fernandez Anderson analyzes indicators within social movements and political institutions to account for abortion reform happening or not, and its extent. Things such as whether the movement is strong or not, whether there is a strong left-leaning party in power and or there's a strong party discipline, among others, whether there's a willing executive branch, and the level of influence the Catholic Church has in society and in politics in general. In the case of Argentina, during her period of analysis, which was from 2003 to 2017, she was witnessing a strong movement, the campaign itself, but several institutional variables were not lining up. A right-leaning coalition was in power. The executive branch, surprisingly, was allowing discussion of a bill in Congress, but was not disciplining the coalition to vote in favor. And the Catholic Church held a strong influence in the Senate, which represents the different provinces, many of whom have very conservative electorates to this day. This resulted in the bill not being passed in 2018, but with the willing executive coming into office in late 2019, the scenario looked very different, particularly in a country where the executive holds a strong power over the other two branches of government. Now, this second question, the way I posed it originally, I can admit is a bit biased in that it already contains a tentative, though incomplete answer. It should read more like, how did abortion become mainstream in social and political debate? Or in terms of Davi and Mosley, how did abortion went from impolitic to politics directly? Not directly. The quote on screen and the pictures illustrate this passage. So the quote, I'd just like to take a moment to read it. In the corner of Rivadavia and Callao, which is the corner of the National Congress, a group of women is handing out handheld flyers. They have a folding table and a megaphone. They jump on people passing by El Molino Cafe, asking for their support. Some sign the petition, others tell whisper stories. Many of them scream murderers. They insist. This is their stop every other Monday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. It is 1991, and these women dare to talk about abortion on the street in front of Congress, when getting contraceptives for free is not even a right yet. And the picture to the bottom left, it's actually these women with the table and the megaphone. That's actually taken in 1991. Fast forward to some of the green pictures that we're seeing, this green tide of hundreds, thousands across the country, many of them very, very young. This is the illustration of how time has passed in this campaign. So Davi and Mosley resort to the argument of framing, but they do so with an incomplete premise. As I mentioned before, their contribution centers around the effectiveness that framing abortion as a social justice issue had in broadening the support for abortion decriminalization, stating that while arguing that reproductive rights were vital to protecting poor women from unsafe clandestine abortions, activists constructed a particularly resonant frame for the Argentine context. This idea that women with resources can get an abortion even if it's not legal, and the ones who suffer the most are the poorer women. However, social justice as a frame seems insufficient in itself, in my opinion. Now we can resort to Sofía Arguello Pazmiño's stages of politicization of sexuality. She also uses frame analysis to understand the political actions of groups around sexuality, but identifies three levels: the constitution of actors, the definition of the situation, and the strategies and resources for action. So it wouldn't just be about defining the situation, abortion as a matter of social justice, but about building the activist front itself and reflecting on the diverse ways the goals both of legalization and ending social stigma around abortion can be achieved. Florencia Abate, a feminist journalist, concurs. She says that one of the great triumphs of the feminist and trans-feminist movement in Argentina is to have built hegemony through many years and set its own views onto the public opinion, reframing the debate around its true access, achieving the acknowledgement of the claim by most of society, which is what we saw in Congress in 2018 and 2020. The debates were just wonderful. Now, I don't have that much time, so at this point, I would like to start concluding with some lessons that we can take forward. And again, I spoke recently about this in a presentation that I linked on this panel's Whova platform a few days ago. So I don't want to take too much time going into this in detail, but I do want to close with a couple of comments for our discussion, given the topic that brings us all together. First, a theoretical one regarding the potential of the concept of critical junctures for strengthening this type of analysis. I'm posing it more as a question because, granted, the literature on critical junctures focuses more on breaking path dependency and historical institutionalism. But what is the study of abortion in Latin America if not a big opportunity to challenge path dependency in the lack of access to sexual and reproductive health rights for women and LGBTQ+, or reproductive justice in general? I wonder if you have any thoughts on this first. My second comment regards concerns about intersectionality throughout the efforts made by the campaign. One key lesson from advocates in the campaign relates how the movement evolved to include demands from trans and non-binary communities. Inclusive language made it into the law, which states that it applies to people with the ability to get pregnant. This is very important. Mauro, a trans activist and historian, points out that to be entitled to abortion rights, trans people had to first be acknowledged as subjects of reproductive rights. He refers to the gender identity law, the first of its kind in Latin America, and I think one of the first ones around the world, that was passed in 2012. This was not an easy battle, and trans-exclusionary discourse is still a risk to be monitored even in the implementation of these and other laws related to reproductive justice and gender. In addition, journalist Luciana Mignoli chronicles the reflections and concerns of women belonging to indigenous people and the alliances they build with trans organizations because they too felt excluded from the debates throughout the campaign. In Argentina, we still need to acknowledge how both racialization and plurality coexist in the fabric of our society and how it can generate barriers for effective access to abortion on demand. Much as up until this point, there were barriers to access sexual education and contraception in small indigenous communities, usually influenced by the Catholic Church. I post these comments so we can collectively reflect on how struggles against inequalities face all sorts of barriers across the Global South, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. This is the bibliography I've used. I'll make the PDF available shortly if you want. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melissa. You finished way ahead of time, 3 minutes ahead.
Oh.
So well done, and a very concise presentation that will raise lots of questions, particularly around discourse, how you frame not just the social justice framing issue, which also has an intersectional dimension in terms of class and gender, but also the other aspects in terms of how do you frame, how do you make it inclusive, who gets included, whose voices are heard in that framing. But apart from that, there are issues around what you mentioned, around sort of how do you look at and understand the contextual shifts, so the timeline that you show and what shifted. Executives suddenly being interested, but at the same time, you have the Catholic Church to contend with. And we have seen other pressures in the region. So what makes Argentina kind of different, or Uruguay for that matter? So we'll park those questions and keep the questions coming in the chat box. If you have questions, you'll have a chance basically to ask questions yourselves. But if you have immediate questions that are popping up, put them in the chat box. We are keeping an eye on it. So we will move on to the next presentation. So our next sort of focus is on India. So from Latin America, we are going to South Asia. Our presenters are Deepta Chopra, who is a fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. She is a feminist social scientist who works quite a lot on women's empowerment and unpaid care work. Most of you are probably familiar with her work, but she also leads a major project looking at backlash against women's rights in South Asia. With her is Amu Sano, who is a development practitioner and social scientist based in India. She focuses a lot on women's collective and their association to empowerment of women and girls, so women collectively organizing. So Amu will be presenting the paper, which is titled Becoming Mother Activists, Deconstructing the Boundaries of Ghar and Bahir in Shaheen Bagh. Most of you are familiar with Shaheen Bagh protests that happened before the major shutdown that we faced in South Asia, and that sort of electrified and led to lots of ripple responses in terms of protest against the Citizenship Act that India passed. So this is looking at the public-private boundary, but also looking at how women push back when state comes up with oppressive measures. So Amu, over to you. You have 15 minutes. I'll give you a warning at 13.
Thank you, Samina. Deepta, should I share my screen? Is that, and Deepta and I will be presenting together. I'll be taking the first half. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay. So our presentation will be structured thus. We will be first clarifying some conceptual terms, especially the ones that frame our work, the Ghar and the Bahir. We'll be moving on to the context of the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and then moving on to some empirical findings, key empirical findings from our fieldwork that were done during 4 months of the struggle, which was unfortunately shut down with the first wave of COVID and lockdown in India. And finally, concluding with some thoughts on sustainability, on how this movement can move forward. So finally, just thoughts on sustainability. Our work is framed by the Ghar and the Bahir. The ghar, or the home, is the private family space, while the bahar is the public outside. The public space being that of politics and work, while the home is the space of family, has been criticized by feminist scholars who argue that this distinction is an ideological construction rather than a reflection of reality. The two domains, especially for women, do not exist in opposition, but share a relationship of reciprocity. While this binary has started to break down in some literature, most prominently in women's economic participation, where processes of production are very much embedded within the homestead, a majority of work on political participation and resistance continues to uphold the public-private binary. Although women's political participations in areas such as voting and political rallies is being increasingly recognized, little attention has been paid to how political participation is intrinsically connected to the private realm as well. To understand our key inquiry of why Muslim women, specifically Muslim women, came out to protest for the first time and engage with the anti-CAA movement, it became important for us to problematize this public-private divide and conceptualize these spaces as continuous or contiguous. Drawing from Radhika Gujala's 2019 work, where the concept of home includes religious communities, religiously bound communities, and anyone who is not part of that community is forms or constitutes the bahar or the outside, our work also started to expand the boundaries of the ghar and the bahar and see these as culturally defined domains that are continuously evolving and being reconstructed. A strict public-private divide relegates women to the private space, which is often seen as apolitical. Feminist scholars have worked to repoliticize this space by advancing the slogan, "The personal is political," and in the process, giving a political language to the private sphere. This understanding has seldom been put forward to political struggle, and therefore have left gaps in understanding for women's motivations to join political resistance. This is not to say that women have not occupied the space of the bahar, but for women who themselves profess that they were first-time protesters, the motivation to step from the ghar to the bahar, or to come out, articulated in their own understanding of these realms, gave rise to the understandings that these spaces need to be seen as contiguous. A second important area of this framing is how the private sphere came to be part of the bahar. Women's leadership and greater participation altered the nature of the struggle, as well as the actual space of resistance. Women brought their care roles with them, which became visible in the public side of protest. In doing so, women changed the definitions of what constitutes the space of protest and flipped the personal is political to the political is personal. Finally, we do recognize, and there needs to be a recognition, that a framing of political participation of women in terms of care and care responsibilities that they bring to the bahar spaces raises a question of the gendered nature of such resistance. However, we have found that framing the struggle in terms of care, and as Deepta will go ahead, and framing terms of care not only for the home, but extending it to the nation, which was very much the context of the CAA, opened up a possibility space for these women to become activists, which they had not been before. With that brief framing of our work, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Samu. Could you go to the next slide, please? Great. So just in terms of the context, Sahel has already explained a little bit, but I'll just let you know that basically India passed a Citizen Amendment Act along with some National Register of Citizens and National Population of Citizens Register, etc., which basically meant differential treatment for people who had who were from different religions, specifically that like while like it was basically about the fact that people were wanting to, well, the government wanted the citizens to kind of show documents to prove their Indianness and to prove that they were Indian, and this was seen, this is widely discriminatory, recognized as widely being discriminatory against the Muslim population, both resident in India for generations, but also for the refugees that India takes in. So in this context, Shaheen Bagh protests really erupted with some police brutality on students in a particular university called Jamia Millia, where police stormed in, beat up students who were basically studying in libraries, and when this news got to Shaheen Bagh, which is basically the nearest locality from Jamia, from the university, where actually a lot of the families of these students live, and the students also live. There was quite a vivid reaction to this, and from kind of like a midnight meeting to spiraling into real kind of strategy of saying that women should step forward, and this was a strategy also because Muslim men in contemporary India have been targeted and vilified, and police brutality and state brutality is very common. So this was a strategy that to put women forward. So the Shaheen Bagh protest started. Could you just go to the next slide, please, Amu? With these women coming out, as Amu said, as ostensibly spoken as first-time protesters, because they were entering the public space of the protest for the first time. So in this context, we went in and wanted to understand the strategies of their resistance and what their experiences of their resistance has been. And I'd categorize these, and our paper talks about two main forms of resistance, really. One is to kind of like, as Anu said, that really thinking about the personal space as being a political space, and extending the boundaries of what women conceptualized as the ghar, or their homes. And here there's a mural of a woman holding the Constitution of India, as well as a quote which a woman protester said, which is really beautiful, which says, "Dharna hi ghar hai," which is, the protest site is our home. नेता भी खुद हैं, we are leaders ourselves. आवाम भी खुद हैं, we are the people. रहनुमा भी खुद हैं, we are also the ones who inspire. And when we talked to them, there was this quote that really also stuck out, where one of the women said, "Those who raise children and educate them, even if they themselves are literate, though they know how a house must be run, they also then know how a nation must be run." So these extending and conceptualizing and reconceptualizing the boundaries of the ghar as not only women's home, but actually India being their home space, and that is what was under threat, was really visible. And this is what we found, that women were able to reconceptualize and perhaps also sustain the participation of the protest in these very patriarchal settings. Next slide, please. And then the second part was about kind of bringing the ghar to the bahar. So, carrying out household responsibilities in the public space of the protest. There was a children's tent set up, but also children and women were in the mainstay of the tent. And that was just one very visual representation of the care that women extended to these public spaces. The other two were more subtle. One was about this kind of symbiotic relationship between the students. As I said, the students were part of this, this community, and women had come out to kind of say, we care for our students, we care for our children. And there was another saying which said, it's not just that they were biological mothers. They said, one of the women said to us, हमारे नहीं भी सही किसी के तो हैं. So they're not ours, but at least they're somebody's children. So the idea of kind of like caring for children, and in turn that symbiotic relationship was reciprocated by the students who acted as volunteers, organized the stage, did a lot of running around, a lot of artwork was generated by these students as well. And the third was kind of extending this boundary of care to people who they were resisting against. So kind of like saying that, you know, we should not we should counter the bullets with flowers. They extended an invitation to the Prime Minister for a cup of tea. They says, we don't want anything else, just come and talk to us over a cup of tea, right? And this kind of like these conceptualization of kind of like saying that we are, you know, we are one, and this kind of like, you know, saying that the political is very much a personal space as well, was embodied by these women. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so finally, in terms of conclusions, what we conclude in our paper, and I've gone through a very brief overview of the paper, is that public spaces of protest, of course, can coexist within and in conjunction with the private realm of women's everyday lives. And we saw this in the ebb and flow of the movement of the everyday space of the site, where women would go do their care responsibilities, sometimes cook and clean. Younger women would go, older women would stay all night because they could you know, pass on their care responsibilities to other people. But just this kind of like idea of the coexistence of the public and private space, and also, as we said, the redrawing of the boundaries of the ghar, which allowed women to transcend those seemingly very kind of like patriarchal boundaries of like, you know, being within the home and not being seen outside. But actually they were able to still maintain a semblance of what should I say, of boundary, where, you know, it was, the main tent was a very physical representation of the boundary, where women were inside this boundary and men were outside this boundary. And so there was a boundary space, but there was this redrawing of the boundaries of what this ghar entailed, which allowed them to politically participate in this struggle. Final point, sustainability of the act of becoming these mother activists, right? So they became activists, but they retained their caring roles of mothers, and that's why we're terming them as mother activists. Now, COVID-19 happened March 20th, absolute lockdown. Site was demolished in late March 2019 as well. And since then, you know, these discussions have, we're trying to find out, and it's very hard because, you know, there's a very real culture of repression, and it's kind of like, you know, but we do know that there have been some discussions in digital spaces. Now, whether these discussions retain that warmth, that solidarity, that care that women had built into this public space is yet to be seen. But also in terms of the discussion of this reorganizing of care itself as being primarily a women's domain, which had started to kind of move a little bit with you know, men taking on a little bit more of the care responsibilities, allowing women to participate in that. And we saw that as well happening. But how long will that continue? Has that continued once women have gone, once the site has been demolished, once the public space of the protest has not been there, and these political responsibilities of who is a leader and who organizes, etc. And all these are questions that we actually time will tell. But it's you know, with the culture of repression, etc., we really don't know at the moment how this will play out. But yeah, so that was a brief overview of our paper, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deepta, for finishing bang on time. So before we move on to the next presentation, obviously you've had an insight on the very old debate that we always have, what is public and what is private in feminist literature. But also we are familiar with mothers and grandmothers being activists, starting with Latin America and those who disappeared. But obviously it's also about when you reclaim, it is a contested way of doing, when you reclaim the very traditional identity, how far does it allow you to push back against the gender norms that the community espouses to? And here you saw that care became quite central to that. But then there are questions around sustainability, and I'm sure it will connect to the paper we have on Pakistan, which also looks at quite a high patriarchal context. I mean, what is the gender natures and constraints in terms of participation, but then how do women create space? Having said that, I also wanted to thank Deepta and Amu for doing this, because this is real-time data, and this was funded by this CEDA-funded project that IDS is implementing, looking at countering backlash, reclaiming gender justice. So from that, we will move on to another project that IDS has that looks at backlash, which is sustaining power, and looking at women's struggles in South Asia. So our presenter is Progga Mohapara, who's a research associate based at the BRAC Institute of Development and Governance and Development, BIGD, at BRAC University. She works quite a lot on looking at domestic violence, adolescent rights, and also looking at backlash currently with us. And her co-author is Mahin Sultan, who is a senior fellow of practice, based also at BIGD, has extensive experience on gender and development, as you know, and if you're reading on feminist movements in Bangladesh, you will read her work. So Progga, over to you. You have 15 minutes. I will give you a 2-minute warning. So Progga.
Thank you, Solap. I'll just share my screen. Can you see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, greetings everyone. It is a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful panel. Today we will be presenting on our research on countering sexual harassment in educational institutes, Jahangirnagar University Students Movement. I am Progga Mohapara. I'm a research associate at BIGD, and the co-author of this research is Mahin Sultan, my colleague. She's a senior fellow of practice at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. Our presentation structure looks somewhat like this. At first, we will discuss the purpose of this research, and then we will move on to the context to understand the scenario of sexual harassment in public spaces in Bangladesh. Then we will dig deeper into the movement and understand the background and unpack the strategies that were being used by the key actors during the 1990s, during the start of the movement, and what were their struggles back then. And then we will end our presentation by looking at the current status of the movement and the current status of implementation, the backlash and the ongoing struggles the movement faces. The purpose of our research is to understand how Jahangirnagar University students mobilized for a sexual harassment policy in educational institutes since the 1990s, and the strategies that were used by students and teachers back then to counter resistance and transform the movement into a national movement. We've also tried to analyze the gains made by the movement, the ongoing backlash that it is still facing, and the current strategies the students are using to keep the movement alive. And in order to explore this, we are using the concept of backlash. There are many definitions out there in literature, but we thought Flood et al.'s definition of backlash best fits our case, where backlash is defined as resistance against progressive social change. When patterns of inequality and injustice shifts, individuals and groups, particularly those who are advantaged by the status quo, resist. For our research, gender justice actors towards progressive social change wanted a sexual harassment policy. However, this challenged opposing actors who were in power positions, particularly those who were benefited through party politics.
Progga, I'm going to interrupt you a bit. Could you make it full slide and sort of this? We're still at the first slide, so in case you want to show us the other slides, do you want to move?
Oh, it's not moving. Sorry. I think I'll just. Okay. I think the slideshow doesn't work, so I'll just keep it. Now, is it moving?
We are seeing purpose of the research. If that's where you are, then that's fine.
Yes, yeah. This is. Sorry, apologies for that.
So keep doing whatever you are doing.
So we will be using this concept for our research, the concept of backlash that has been defined by Flood et al. And their definition of backlash, because for our research case, demanding for a separate sexual harassment policy was a step by gender justice actors towards progressive social change for having a separate sexual harassment policy. However, this was challenging opposing actors who were in power positions, and particularly those who benefited through party politics, which ultimately resulted in contestations. And these intentional and sustained actions were later visible during critical junctures throughout the movement, which we will unpack during the presentation. Our methodology included interviews with movement actors. This included student bodies and activists and alumni, students and teachers. And we also used the political economy analysis to map out critical actors and their relevant powers in the movement. And we also conducted analysis on secondary literature, newspaper and document review back from the 1990s to understand the dynamics and history of the movement. And as mentioned before, this research is a part of a larger project that is being funded by the ESRC, and we are doing it in collaboration with IDS, which looks into backlash against women's rights and the strategies and countering backlash. And we are also grateful to our colleagues for their help in our piece of work. Further looking into the details, it is important that we understand the context of sexual harassment in Bangladesh. According to a survey conducted by the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics back in 2015, 27.8% of women reported on experiencing non-partner physical violence. And in much recent studies in 2018 on sexual harassment in public spaces, it was seen that almost 87% of the respondents were unaware of the High Court directive guidelines. And this also includes adolescents, particularly who are aged between 15 to 19 years old, where 30.9% of them reported of experiencing non-partner physical violence. And in this era of digitization, online sexual harassment remains highly prevalent, and in a recent study in 2017, it was seen that 73% of women using the internet has complained or reported of facing cybercrime. Now, if we look deeper into the movement, it is important to understand the characteristics of Jahangirnagar University. Why this university? This is a public residential university, and the university has always had created scope for student political wings for them to mobilize, including the left parties. And the university also had a tradition of cultural activism with its 153 student organizations who actively engage in certain international and national issues and activism. The university students as well as the teachers are politicized, and often being from the ruling factions, teachers and students take advantage of their power positions because of their political affiliations, and it is often seen that the perpetrators are affiliated with the ruling party, or they sought to affiliate themselves with the ruling party to get away with crimes. There were many critical junctures and turning points in the movement, but this is best described through a timeline, as we can see. It goes back in the 1990s, particularly in 1992, when there was a rape incident in the bus when a female student was raped by a male student in the university, and the campus burst into protest, and that was the first time there was a demonstration against sexual harassment in the university campus. Fast forward to 1998 to 1999, the university erupted again with protests as there were allegations of rape against 4 ruling party students in the campus. And there were multiple newspaper reports that were reporting on similar incidences across educational institutes and public spaces in Bangladesh. These resulted students and progressive teachers to mobilize together, and frontline women leaders were selected and elected through certain hostile law and meeting strategies. The university also formed an investigation committee to look deeper into the issue, but there were delays in procedures and inadequate action, and the syndicate described these acts as morally degrading, and the main perpetrator received a lifelong expulsion, and the others received 1 to 3 years of expulsion. No further legal actions were actually taken. In the year of 2000, a number of progressive teachers drafted a policy and submitted it to the university administration, but the policy never saw the light of the day. Again, in 2006, there was another changing moment where there were complaints of sexual harassment against an influential teacher of the university, and which ignited protests in the campus. campus, and students demanded dismissal of the teachers and again adoption of a policy. However, the committee of the university came up with a disappointing announcement that the teacher was exonerated of all charges of sexual harassment as they had not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But on the other hand, temporary expulsion orders against the 4 women complainants were given, and 2 male students who gave evidences were also expelled. There were protests continued, and in 2008 to 9, the movement expanded beyond the university, and a draft policy was submitted to the government by the UGC with the heated protest, the University Grant Commission, that is. And at the same time, there were writ petitions submitted by a legal aid organization, BNWLA, and finally the High Court directives were issued in 2009. There were multiple key actors in the movement, such as student bodies and political wings and professors, teachers, human rights organizations, as well as government authorities like the UGC. And these actors used a number of strategies to take the movement forward. In terms of mobilization, female leaders came out, and these leaders were elected through hostels. Per hostel had 1 women leader, and these were selected by women who were from the university by an all-women's vote. In terms of protest demonstration, there were strategies such as sit-ins and petitions and collections of evidence. And a very strong statement emerged, which was used by all the women leaders in the movement, which said, "We all have been raped." In order to show solidarity and to protect the identity and respect the privacy of the students who were assaulted. There were also strategic partnerships, student-teachers partnerships, or alliances with newspapers to increase the reporting of incidences. They were also building networks with other universities, and the movement spread beyond the university and reaching out to human rights and women's rights organizations. There were also transnational linkages, such as teachers who were forming the draft policy. They researched policies of European and North American universities to form a strong draft. They were also using political rupture, such as when a caretaker government, which is elected to avoid fraud, tampering of elections, they used such an opportunity to mobilize against powerful students who came from ruling party or powerful political party affiliations. And also using government spaces, being included in committee membership, as well as submitting public interest litigations to the High Court directives were used. And finally, a brilliant documentation of all the ongoing movement reports and newspaper reports gathered together to keep the movement alive. And there were multiple gains of the movement, actually. And to start with the High Court directive, which was a landmark judgment and which led to the formation of committees in different universities and workplaces. And the movement also made way for building change in narratives, where the word rape or dharshon in Bangla was integrated into the public discourse and opened up spaces for discussion and protests on issues. And the matter of sexual harassment was ultimately recognized as a serious offense. These are some newspaper clippings back in the 1990s showing women mobilizing. And it now brings us to analyze how well has the movement sustained these gains over the years. And to understand the current status of the movement, our research showed that the movement has rather become incident-based, rather issue-based, and it has lost its rigor and liveliness. The High Court directive, which was rather to be treated as a law and followed by all educational and institutes and workplaces, has made negligible progress in terms of implementation. Complaint mechanisms remain inactive, and even if universities do have written policies on sexual harassment, they are never put into action. And there is female participation, but leadership remains majorly absent. So where is the backlash? Backlash is of two forms here. One from the lack of implementation by university authorities, and the other is on the stigmatization and vilification these students face when reporting complaints. In terms of university authorities, they have not informed students about sexual harassment guidelines, and they do not usually brief students about the existence of the committees, and therefore students do not have any idea about what constitutes of sexual harassment and what not. And on the other hand, it has not been prioritized by the government, and the University Grants Commission runs low on human resources and logistic support, which makes following up on cases difficult. But a larger form of backlash is seen in stigmatization of students. Often students hesitate to file complaints in fear of being blamed or in fear of character assassination. For the masculinized political culture of our country, students feel that there are no possibilities of getting redress due to the political influential role of the alleged offenders. And also in this era of digitization, female activists majorly face cyber harassment and bullying in messages and in the comment section of their posts for their engagement in activism. And another crucial point is identity politics, which this quote that we've put describes the best, where it depends on which party complainants represent or against which party representatives are the complaints being made. Filing complaints against ruling party students or teachers put students or women's academic career at risks, and therefore they would rather post any news or views online about incidences and be victim blamed than putting their grades at stake. So they are using a number of strategies to counter this, such as social media, sharing Facebook posts, status updates, etc. They're also making use of available resources and allies and building strategic relationships and still having physical presence, such as marches, cycle rallies, blockades, etc. But a major part also depends on building solidarity with national and international movements and observing days and events to keep their presence alive. But are these strategies working? How successful are these? Our research, however, suggests that in recent times, the movement has rather become diluted. Though online activism generates greater participation and engagement, these are not sustainable. Even online posts against perpetrators do not have any lasting effects. And then the present political settlement also explain why the movement is at a low point. During the initial stage and peak of the movement, the political settlement of our country was a competitive clientelist and had democratic spaces which created scope for strong civil society movements and scope for associations. However, in recent times, as we have a dominant party rule, there has been shrinking of civic spaces for contestation and rights-based discussion. With the increased surveillance of individuals and organizations, freedom of speech and presenting opposing views against the government has significantly curtailed. Most protests are therefore seen as to be political, something that is considered to be anti-government because of their leftist presence. And as a result, there's a fear of mobilization. So the current strategies was successful and is successful in sustaining the activism, but these unfortunately have not been successful in promoting system reform. Also, COVID situation has made things more challenging as physical presence remains almost impossible with the university premises being closed, and unlike previous times, students and teachers partnerships are weak and prominent women leaders are absent, which female student activists could look up to as role models to take forward the movement. So therefore, we can conclude that the overall change in actors, the political context, and the dynamics, leadership dynamics in particular, has resulted in a diluted movement, which once used to be a very lively movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha, for finishing 1 minute before time. Keep the questions coming in the chat box if you have any for the presenters. I mean, similar themes as you can hear in terms of solidarity building being important, but then how do you sustain movements when your space is closed, which you're seeing in the Indian context. Similarly, the role of critical junctures. So you saw Bangladesh sort of taking advantage of the caretaker government when it came in, or after democratic transition. Melissa raised the same question about critical junctures in terms of how do we look at critical junctures and does it break path dependency or not? So that's something to think about. And of course, the issue about how do you frame and how do you put things in the public discourse? How do you make it mainstream? And lastly, if your physical presence is not there, is online presence enough? So that's a lot of things to think about. So let's move to Pakistan, from where we have a very interesting paper. And it's going to be presented by Jalila Haider and Miguel Loureiro. I'm going to introduce Jalila first because she is playing the speaking part because Miguel decided not to speak. Jalila wears many hats. She's a human rights lawyer and a political activist in Balochistan. She's the face of the Hazara movement, those of you who keep a tab on what is going on in that part of the world. She's currently doing an LLM at Sussex. And she's a very, very brave woman. For Miguel, basically, he works quite a lot on state-citizen relations, accountability, street-level bureaucracy, and he's fantastic with methods and being quite innovative with that. So, Jalila, over to you. You have 15 minutes to present. And their paper is titled Visible Outside, Invisible Inside, the Power of Patriarchy on Female Protest Leaders in Conflict and Violence-Affected Settings. So Jalila, 15 minutes. I'll give you a warning when you have 2 minutes left. Are you having trouble sharing the screen? Do you want us to share?
You're muted right now.
Jalila, you're also muted.
Yeah, I'm just sharing my screen. I don't know why it's not showing.
Do you want us to share? We can share.
Yeah, it is here. Thank you. I got it.
Great. Go ahead, Jalila.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Suhaila, and thank you everyone for letting me to speak today, because it's my ever first presentation that I'm going to present. So it's about the visible outside, invisible inside, from the perspective of the Hazara female protesters who live in conflict zone, who are affected by terrorism, and since last 10 years they are taking part in different protests, peaceful protests, and we will discuss that how these protests emerged and what are the role of these women, and we will discuss also that how much backlash and harassment within the patriarchy and tribalism they have faced. So first of all, I will go to the context of the our research, that it is basically that why when these women are taking lead in the public protest, we see that their leadership is invisible, and as well as within the community inside the house they face too much harassment, and their decision powers and everything are not as visible as we see them taking part within the protest. So in this we had case studies. Considering our case studies, we have taken two main themes, like for our considering the literature review of the protest all around the world, whatever several, like just like Bangladesh, India, and other part, Palestine, and Venezuela, we see that there are so many protests, and we consider it from our interviewers, those women who were taking active part and role in these protests within in Balochistan, in Quetta. So our people whom we interviewed are mostly from different age groups, of course different class of women, educated, uneducated, as well as religious and ethno-nationalist groups, and those progressive ladies who think their approach are different, but they have given their output in our case study. So when we look into the timeline of the Hazara public protest in Quetta, we can see that the attacks on Hazaras emerged from 1980s, and it is going on till now, till 3rd of January 2021. So looking into the background, during 1980s, whenever there were attacks on Hazaras, on the grounds of their ethnic and sectarian identities. So there were those male member of the community who were participating in the protest, and sometimes it ends up with the mobs and violent protest. As the result, we see that there were like less other communities' interest about the Hazaras. But in 2004, when there was a bomb blast on mosque, so Hazara male again, I remember that they were holding these patrols and other things. They burned the city, and it was a kind of mob, and government enforced curfew, arrest people. And this is one side of this violent protest, male violent protest, that in one hand Hazara people were dying, on the other hand there were FIRs against them, and they were in the become under the observation of the government. And people started, other communities of the Quetta city started hating Hazaras because they had this perspective that they are violent people, and they are not in conformity with the other communities. They don't respect them. But in 2006, there was again a mosque bombing. It was a suicide attack, and this time there were isolated women protest, means like women were joining men, but that was not a specific protest that women were taking part. But in 2011, when there was a Mastung bus shooting, when the passengers were identified and killed, this time the protest was initiated by women, and it was for the first time that Hazara women came out, and they were asking state for the protection. It was a kind of the peaceful protest. It was in a group, but it was not identified a group. People were calling them as a Hazara women, but the influence of this protest was that religious and nationalist groups also were sending their women protesters in that protest, which was initiated by common household women of Hazara community. In the transition, again, it was shift from 2013, when there was a huge bomb blast in 2 different months, like a gap of 20 days, and around more than 200 people died in both 2 attacks. So for the first time, Hazara women resisted that the bodies of the martyrs should not be buried, but they were keeping those bodies on the roads, and started protesting. It was a peaceful sit-in, and it pushed the religious and nationalist parties also to join that protest. And for the first time, it was a bigger impact that after this protest, the government of Balochistan, provincial government, was dissolved, and governor rule was enforced in the province. Then in 2018, I myself went on hunger strike because the result of target killings of so many Hazara men, target killing. It was a 6-day hunger strike till death, and as the result, Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, he met us along with the 20 other Hazara women as the leader. It was for the first time that they recognized Hazara women to lead, and we were part of the decision making. In past, there were, like in 2013 and 2011, women were part of the protests, but they were not given this chance to come forward. And again in January 2021, when the coal miners were killed, although I was not there, but it was again led by women, and it was a nationwide protest. So as far as we see that within this series of the protests, there are so many barriers. It is not easy for every woman in the world, all across the world. They face sexism, harassment, patriarchy. But for the Hazara women, it was quite different. First of all, the main barrier is when they were going and joining these protests, their identities were invisible. Like they were not identified as a woman, as a leader, or someone who themselves are existing, but as a mother of someone, sister of someone, daughter of someone. For example, if we look into our literature, like Karen and Mogandam also mentioned this in their literature, that how in Venezuela, Czechoslovakia, and Plaza de Mayo, the role of women were like more into as a cultural group, and they are like in nationalist and right-wing protests, and even in revolutions, they were just identified as the mother of someone. In this perspective, we see that the role of the mother, political mothers and social motherhood were highlighted, but as a women, they were not visible. On the other hand, if we see the Kashmiri women role and their protest, as Swati mentions, that when we look into the slogans that Hum Maaye, Hum Behne, Hum Betiya, we are daughters, we are mothers, we are sisters. So it means that they, even in Kashmiri armed struggle, the identity of women itself is invisible, but they are associating themselves with some not women as a women, but women related to some men. And we can see that again in the case of the Manipur, again this identity of women is invisible, as mentioned by Panchali Roy. So these things are like in many literatures, like in Bhopal protest, again the role of women is invisible, and they are just identified as daughters and mothers, but they are actively participating and making these movements and protests successful. On the other hand, when we see that the role of these women are like shielding men, women as a protectors, like they are joining these protests not to become visible as a leaders, but to protect their men from arrest, from detentions, and saving them from state operations. For example, again, so Swati mentions that how this in Kashmiri, how Kashmiri women are supporting their men in armed struggle and shielding them in somehow, like taking Kalashnikovs under their dress and delivering them. But though the form of their struggle is different, but we can see that their roles are same, that they are women as a protector. It is not that women as a leaders. And we can see that again, that in the Palestinian women struggle in Fitida, again, it is like they are fighting two phases, one state oppression, and again they are standing for their men to fight for their rights. So again, when we look into the further going on, when we look into the it is like when we look into the protest role of women in the protest, so we can see that women are facing two fronts, like one is state oppression and the other is toxic patriarchy within the protest, naming and shaming. We can see that in the Palestinian women movement, we can see that in Egyptian Arab Spring movement, like Elizabeth Johnson also highlighted this issue, that how the women are facing discrimination and gender violence within the protest. Within the Hazara community, women are asking straight for justice, equality, and peace. On the other hand, when they come from from back to front, so they face naming and shaming, like male members take their photos and publishing it on social media, and were saying that she's a shameless woman, she comes forward and she has no shame, and pushing them back. So this kind of harassment, both online and offline, Hazara women faced, and this made them not to join protest. Sometimes it is kind of discouraging them to join such protest. When we look into the intersectional perspective, so again we can see that the gender and class perspective is cannot be ignored. Like within the Kashmir, Egypt, Palestinian women, we can see that at one place they face discrimination on the grounds of their gender. On the other hand, they face discrimination on the grounds of class. For example, one of our interviewers, she said that if it is Benazir Bhutto, people give them a leadership role because they think that her class is she belongs from upper class. But in our case, they do not allow us to come forward. On the other hand, when we see one of our other interviewers, she also shared that in recent Mach attack, Shehla Raza, the senator of Pakistan People's Party, she joined the protest, so the stage was given to her to speak because she is a senator. But when we asked for the same, so they said that you are a woman, you should go and sit behind. It is not your work to come and forward and take the lead position. What we have found within these protests, even though we know that there are so many protests all around the world, there are so many women movements. So what we feel that there are backlash, there are harassment, but the magnitude of backlash and harassment within the Hazara community and women protester is have three dimensions. The first thing is the patriarchy. It is and this patriarchy is like resulting into tribalism and this identity politics. The deep-rooted patriarchy is like within the tribal, a Hazara woman cannot show her face to the outside. Any journalist or someone who does not belong from Hazara community, her face should not be visible to them. They should hide their face, they should hide their name. And this is what that Hazara women, within our interviews, they have highlighted this, that how this tribalism is impacting their decision-making role. And on the other hand, the identity politics, just like the nationalism and too much religiosity, like Hazara women and religious Shia women, these identities are again pushing them that a Shia woman is like a good women. She follows Bibi Fatima and Bibi Zainab, and she should not she should keep covering herself when she is part of the protest. Those who don't hide their face, even they face harassment. So in these harassment, when even the protests are over, when these women go out of this protest, they face so much backlash that it impacts their mental peace, as well as it prevents them to not to join further protests. This is something that Hazara women are facing, and our paper is about it. What is impact of
2 minutes, Dalila?
Yeah, just a minute. Yeah, it is the last. Just looking into the protest today and after. In protest before, when it was a male violent protest, so it was a kind of riots, curfew, and public opinion was against Hazara people. Hazaras lost their allies like Pashtuns and Balochs, and it was mostly male centered. Today, when it is protest, Hazara women, when they take part of it, so it is about the public opinion softened towards Hazara people. They feel that they are oppressed community. On the other hand, the other communities are even joining this protest. Hazaras gained alliance. And as we see that Chief of Army Staff acknowledged that Hazara women leadership to talk and speak to them. So it is like it is more of women centered. Thank you for your time and
Thank you, Jalila, for a fantastic presentation of what's happening. Obviously, it raises questions about the context. As you know, this is a violent and conflict-affected context. So organizing there, protesting there is not easy, and particularly if you have very entrenched patriarchal gender norms that limit women's access to public space and mobility. It's a very, very different kind of set of challenges that you face, as Jalila was talking about. It's both how do you sort of contest the state, but also how do you contest the community for which you are actually mobilizing, right? So that's a hard kind of situation. Having said that,
and the one with us who are in civic society.
Mike, please. So having said that, the floor is open for questions. I know there are already questions for Jalila in the chat box, and I have looked at that. But before I ask Jalila to answer these, are there other questions? So the floor is open. You can raise your hand if you want to ask questions, or unmute your mic, whichever way you want to do it. Anyone wanting to take a stab? Otherwise, Naila, I can see you have unmuted yourself, so go ahead, Naila. We can't hear you, Naila. It might be the connection or the headphone. Still can't hear you. Do you want to type it in the chat box? Then we can take it. No, so I'll pose the questions that were posed to Jalila while others think about their questions. So Jalila, there is a question from Maheen asking, could you elaborate a bit more around why women are not able to have more leadership role in the movement? I guess that is about the patriarchal constraints you're talking about. So I'll bundle it with Aisha's question, which is about how can women become more visible? I mean, they have visibilized their role, but what are the strategies for doing that? So if you could come back on that, Jalila, any thoughts?
Well, this is, as I have mentioned in my presentation, that it is not only patriarchy, it is not only that being a religious identity, but it is a politics of identity that they play around the victimhood, around the when people are victim, they associate them with a specific identity, and just like Hazara women and Shia women. So this tribalism and strong religiosity, it hinders women to come forward and take a leadership position. On the other hand, they use it. They use even in our interviews. What I have reached to conclusion that they use women voices and their presence as a tool, but they don't accept it as the their existence, that they are existing as a leader. Sometimes they use the judgments like they are naqisul aqal, the judgments of about women, that they have no rationality to make decisions. That's why they are alienating it. It is not something that Hazara society is illiterate society, or we have 99% of education, but still when it comes to the decision making, they even allow women to be part of the protest. These spaces are reclaimed by Hazara women. It was not that allowed by men, but they accept it. but still they have this deep-rooted patriarchy that it should not be broken. And it is very simple people who give response into the interviews. They said that most of our religious and nationalist groups, they fear that their power will be distributed. They don't want to share their power with women. It is very political, they said. Like Michelle mentioned in the Iran resistance movement during the revolution, that how they were using these Irani women were part of the resistance movement during 1979. But when the revolution was over, these women are sent back to home. Not only sent back to home, but there were specific rules imposed upon them that how should they cover themselves, and it was so oppressive. And some Irani women, they regret to be part of these revolutionary movement. This is something that it is invisible, that Hazara women, they are educated. Most of them say we have this right to go and work, but when it comes to the decision part, they are not taken into loop, because it is fear of the distribution of power. No one is ready, and if you have deep-rooted tribal patriarchy, so it is not easy that women take freedom out of it. But they are reclaiming it. The best part of it is, and they are doing it. So it is going on. It is a long process, but still they are fighting. Over to you, Miguel.
I was just going to add, I mean, as we started comparing the interviews with the data, sorry, with the literature, it was a lot of similarities, but it was the magnitude. So it's not identity politics. It's toxic identity politics on steroids. It's patriarchy on steroids. And that's what we notice. So for instance, Hazara women, a lot of the men will tell you, and some of the women, that but we already have a role for women. And they go back in history. Remember when Hazara women, the invader came and they all killed themselves. It reminded me of Rajasthan. And that's the point, is that this confluence between religiosity, Shiism, Shia religiosity, and this toxic identity politics of what it is to be Hazara women, what it is to be Hazara men. So the other thing is that men started talking about, well, we were like the Gurkhas during the British Empire. So we were warriors. And it's this toxicity that on steroids that you see in these protests. So yeah, so it's the magnitude that shocked us, I think.
It's definitely the magnitude, but it's also, there's an important question there in terms of what do you choose to remember about the history, and what does it mean to be a man in a conflict situation? What does it sort of highlight? And who do you have power over? And most of the time you have power over women, and you want to control your identities. That becomes sort of a key focus. Naila, you have logged back in, so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was on Whoa or whatever it's called, so I'm now on Zoom. So I think it works better. My question was actually to the India presentation. And my question was, we got a very nice account of, dissolving the boundaries between home and the world, between the personal and the political. And a lot of it was about focusing on the ways in which women were bringing with them their caring responsibilities and their identities as, universal carers, even if we don't have children. What I didn't get, and it may be there in another as part of the research, is these women are largely Muslim. They are confronting a genocidal state that is being guilty of suspending human rights, violating international law, etc. It's not enough to sit and bring your caring responsibilities into the public domain. So what I thought was interesting about the Hazara presentation was there was more attention to the political, the maneuverings, the ways in which they were seeking to build an alliances and so on. So I don't know enough about the Shaheen Bagh women, but I would like to know what else were they doing.
Go ahead, Deepta Amu.
should I start? They were doing a lot. Our paper focuses on only one aspect of a multitude of things that we were seeing that was coming out. One, on alliances, there were multiple alliances that were built, not only with other religions, with Sikh, Hindu, Jain, readings happening at the protest site, so that was religious alliances. There were alliances that were built with academics and historians, with people like Ramla Thapar coming in and doing readings at the site. There were every day, there were poets, people from the community speaking, and these, when you sat at the site, what was being said by people speaking, not only from people coming from outside alliances, but also by the women themselves who took to the stage much more frequently as the protests went on, was talking about constitutional rights. The Constitution being the foundation of what they were fighting for. Their rights-based approach was based on what they felt that the Constitution would give them. So there were alliances with academics. There were also alliances with the LGBTQI community, how they were building these alliances with different types of identities. So there were definitely a lot of alliances being built, but also when they speak in two ways, and I think that didn't come out very much in our presentation, but it does come out in the paper more, about speaking of the home and the nation together. And when you speak of the nation as the home, you also start speaking of the politics of that nation. There's a lot of imagery also of, probably as Miguel was saying, about history. So a lot of women actually also told us this has been ordained. This has been written in our history, and we have to fight this because we have to overthrow this, evil monster almost, who has been brought to us to test our faith. But we know that we have the tools within our constitutional rights to overthrow him, because that has also been ordained. Dipta, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Amu. And I think, yeah, I mean, they were doing a lot in terms of in terms of protests and the multiple alliances, etc., and changing the discourse of how, both women's participation is being talked about in politics, but also in terms of how, as Amu said, speaking of the nation as the home. But I think if you're alluding to political maneuvering in terms of kind of like ostensible political participation and alliances with political parties, for example, they distanced themselves very early on. They said, we are not allied to any political party. And this was kind of like the time of the Delhi elections, very conflictual time, led to within the timeline of the struggle. There were riots in Delhi. People were picked up, have spent a year in jail, have just come out. More people are still in jail. So yes, they are facing a very genocidal and horrifically repressive state. And I think what has been, it was very unfortunate, the timing of the of COVID, really, because that really kind of just cut short the movement. And I think it was 100 and how many days? 101 days. 101 days of sitting on the site. But what they were not able to do is beyond the kind of like beyond the Supreme Court educators coming to kind of talk to them, there was no concession at all from the political party in power. Absolutely none. And so yes, I mean, it was, I think.
Can I follow up very, very quickly? Yes, that's the kind of thing I meant, so it wasn't just about performing your caring roles, but also the other stuff. But I wonder to what extent performing these caring, presenting themselves as, you know, women who are mothers and women who look after, would it have helped them to bridge alliances with, on the basis of motherhood, you know, with people that might not normally align themselves with the Muslim cause, but might, if these women were presenting themselves, look, you know, these are our children, this is what we do, this is what you do. I wondered if there was any of that playing to that kind of a identity.
Yeah, well, this is why the alliances were so strong, you see. I mean, you know, it wasn't about just Muslim women. I mean, there were an huge amount of other communities, and not just women, but also men. So Sikh men coming to kind of do this huge langar, this huge kind of like cooking of things. The LGBTQI communities coming to volunteer. The, you know, like, and there was this articulation of not necessarily motherhood, but of the fact that it was important to care for the nation, and it was important to care for the homes, and therefore this is not a Muslim issue. And that's the other thing that they very early on and throughout actually separated themselves from. And that was what the right wing was saying, was that, you know, that these are just Muslim women, and they were constantly saying, no, we're not just Muslim. And, you know, and there were a lot of other community identities. Sorry. Again.
Could you mute your mic? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so those are the alliances. I think that was what they were building.
I just wanted to very quickly also just talk about, actually, in comparison to what Jalila was talking about, the softening when Hazara women came out. That did not happen in India at all. Political parties, or, you know, political heads definitely saw this as hardening lines, and women were seen as troublemakers or the problem. Whereas the government, the central government, has spoken to the farmers and invited the farmers, which is a men-led protest, which is currently ongoing, has invited the farmers into their offices and had multiple rounds of talks with them. That privilege was never offered to the women of Shaheen Bagh, possibly because they were Muslim, but also because they were talking about a larger problem, where they talked about CAA being a problem for the marginalized as a whole, not only for Muslim communities and Muslim women.
Thank you. Any more questions? There is a question in the chat box, but it's for Jalila. So any other types of questions? Okay. Mahinapa, would you like to ask your question to Melissa?
Yes, I didn't finish typing it. I was just wondering, I mean, Melissa, when you were presenting, you were saying that at a certain point, the state had a different view on abortion rights or women's demands from the Catholic Church. And how was that negotiated with, I mean, what kind of stand did the state take, and was it able to, you know, counter the church, and how?
That's a very relevant question, considering the Latin American context and Argentina in particular, even if secularization is advancing in the country, but it's still the official religion, and it's still, the Catholic Church holds a lot of power in local communities, and a lot of representatives in Congress align with being Catholics. That being said, there were many negotiations that were happening behind closed doors and publicly. First of all, some legislators voting as Catholics on a personal level were still voting in favor of legalization, for example. Accompanying the abortion bill, right after the voting, another law was passed called the 1,000 Days Law, that it's an accompanying law for pregnant people and children up until the age of 3. That was a negotiation that was made with religious groups as well, to having, we do have a social security system in place, we do have devices, but that was to make a point of being those consecutive laws, one after the other, they actually numbered consecutively. The other concession that was made, and this was a heated debate within the campaign whether to accept it or not, but eventually it was a compromise that was deemed passable, was the conscientious objection on a personal level, but not on the institutional level. Therefore, a doctor can refuse to make the procedure or to prescribe misoprostol, which is, as of right now, the only drug that's available. Mifepristone is not yet legal. But the institution, a public institution as a whole, public hospital cannot refuse abortion. If there's a private institution that refuses to do so, they have to refer the patient to another facility. So those were some of the concessions that were made.
It's always compromises, right? The issue is about whether the compromises are well chosen or not.
Definitely.
So very quickly, I know we have about 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is basically ask each presenter to reflect in a minute about particular things. So Jalila.
So Kate has a question.
Yeah, Tessa, you want to shoot?
Oh, sorry, just I saw Kate's hand. I don't know if you saw it or not.
Kate, did you have a question?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I had a question about the sort of framing as a backlash, and how we're talking about sort of women organising to counter resistance. But I was just wondering whether there's a difference. When I think about backlash, it seems like it's maybe that some progress has been made and then it's kind of about moving backwards. I was wondering whether there's any difference in terms of our analysis or the kind of activities that are done when it's backlash rather than something that hasn't been achieved yet, if you see what I mean. So like we're pushing for change, and I was just wondering whether in terms of the framing and the sort of looking at it as backlash to progress that has been made, whether that makes any difference theoretically or practically in terms of the responses that we see.
Oh, so Kate's question has a few things in there, and I think that's music to all the backlash researchers on this. One is, of course, Kate is asking basically that does it always have to be about gains? So can the discourse be coming from something that's preemptive, which is talked about in the literature? So if any one of you want to reflect on that. The second bit is, of course, in terms of looking at the literature and this sort of gain push, is that always the case? Because the gain push is also in the discursive domain, right? So all of you are looking at backlash. Who wants to take a stab at this? Anyone?
Well,
go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I can go, but I mean, it's just I think it can be, of course, it can be preemptive because, backlash can be against a perceived gain. So, I mean, in the Shaheen Bagh case specifically, for example, the backlash came after this movement was firmly kind of like in the public domain as because these women had blocked a main road, and that was part of their strategizing, that they would block this main road so that then at least somebody would take notice, because otherwise if they're protesting against in a protest site somewhere in where it's a dedicated protest site, which Delhi does have, then it's not doing anything. It's kind of like there's lots of protests, so they actually blocked, and that was an interesting strategy that actually has been replicated now by the farmers' protest, not in terms of blocking a main road, but actually kind of protesting right at the borders of Delhi, right? So it's kind of like it's big, so that there are there are these implications, and I think. But in terms of the type of backlash, I think what we saw was very interesting was the response to the backlash, where it was so amazing to hear, so there was a slogan that was raised by the right wing saying that they, goli maro salon ko, so you should shoot the traitors, you should shoot these people who are protesting. And in turn, these women said to us, and like in general discourse, they were like, goli nahi, fool do. So don't give them bullets, give them flowers. And it was this kind of constant pressure, but also, yes, I mean, there was a lot of mainstream backlash as well, in terms of, like Amu said, making these women out as troublemakers, as if these were the women who were, they were blocking the road, therefore they were creating inconvenience and there was the public, the mainstream media was full of discussions about whether these women should have blocked the, and, it was like, well, they can protest, but let them unblock the main road. And it's just like, well, actually, that is part of the strategy, right? And so I think that's something that I think it kind of you do react and respond to the backlash, but I think it depends on what the voice of the movement is saying. And in Shaheen Bagh, what the other thing we noticed was that there wasn't one voice. It wasn't that, there wasn't one leader. There wasn't leadership. There wasn't defined leadership. It was very diffuse. So it was like, somebody could say something and somebody could say something else completely. And, it was absolutely fine. And in discussion and deliberation, they would work out that strategy. But yeah, I mean, that's just some reflections from the Shaheen Bagh case.
I guess, Kate, the thing is that these are all real-time cases, right? They're unfolding. We are witnessing them now, as you heard from the cases. In terms of variation of strategy, obviously, yes, it makes sense that it varies because the manifestation of backlash varies. So whether that's about in the literature, if you're reading Flood et al., or our own research has different kinds of backlash identified. So in the Bangladesh case, you saw like there's labeling, there's about threat, there's stigmatizations. That's one aspect. There are direct attacks, that's very different, so obviously, and then there's the discursive framing of things. There are many ways you can sort of look at what is the manifestation and then what strategies then you would take depending on the context and where are the opportunities. So in the Argentinian case, obviously, it took 15 years after forming a coalition. And before that, it was still an issue. It's not like it popped, it became an issue 15 years ago. It was an issue. So it's sort of when does the opposition kind of weaken? So that question about the church and church's linkages and why in Argentina or in Uruguay it happens, but not in Brazil. Like, what's going on? So, there's a lot to unpack, layers and layers in terms of what happens. I can see we only have 3 minutes left. So what I will do, I will use my chair's prerogative because I do want the session to end on time, is just to quickly, briefly draw attention to what is coming. So on Thursday, we also have a session continuing on similar veins. It is Thursday, right? No.
Friday.
Can't hear you. Friday, same time as this session, 2:15. We have a session. So come and hear us. And it's a continuation of this discussion, both in terms of looking at how you resistance in terms of everyday, but also mobilize as a movement, and how you counter the pushback that we are experiencing right now in the world, and which has quite a difficult context. If you think about it, in many countries, the space has shrunk to be able to, the traditional ways that you used to protest or use. There was a question about social media. Well, if you look at the ICT laws that exist in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, using social media is not that easy. You will be persecuted for it. So how visible do you want to be? And when do you want to be visible is a strategic question. And also in the cases that you saw, that physical space was important, blocking the road was important for the sexual harassment movement, anti-sexual harassment movement, staging those protests, or for the Hazaras sort of deciding we will not bury our dead, occupying, those sit-ins are important. So just social media is not enough, or claiming digital platform is not enough. Obviously, a lot of the discourses are shaped in the social media as we see. But there is also the need to be seen in public. the other public domain, so which is also important. So, these are all important questions that we are trying to unpack and understand what happens. But could we have a round of applause for the presenters for such rich empirical case studies, but also raising questions that questions the theory and the literature that exists. So well done to you all. And thank you all for coming and being a part and asking these very insightful questions. I hope to see you all on Friday. Meanwhile, stay safe. And if you have questions, or some of you asked about the PowerPoints or papers, some of the papers are in pipeline. Please do visit our websites for Sustaining Power and Countering Backlash, the IDEAS website. And then for Miguel and Jalila's work, would you like to put the website in the chat box? And Melissa also, if you have publications to share, would you like to put it in the chat box so people can look it up? That would be wonderful. So thank you all so much. We are finishing 1 minute early, so great to have you all. Thank you.